Good evening, welcome to the Fourth Estate. My name is Raymond Mujuni. Here's a quick look at the stories we'll be covering today. The Ugandan media takes a long trip down the memory path as they try to cover the repatriation of Ugandans from different countries. Close to 300,000 Ugandans are stuck in different countries across the globe and they need to come back to their homes because of the COVID-19 pandemic. We look at how the Ugandan media has covered that emerging story. We also look at the story of the election. The Ugandan media takes some advice from the African Center for Media Excellence on how to cover the national election. The advice comes in a webinar.
The court agreed with Mbabazi in his petition. The court dismissed.
2016 election, the African Center for Media Excellence did tremendous amounts of media research in how the Ugandan media had covered the 2016 election. That research fed very much into the Supreme Court petition and the outcomes of that petition. This week, we look at what the African Center for Media Excellence is telling newsrooms across the nation as they get into the 2021 general election and how they should cover it.
The African Center for Media Excellence will be 12 years this year. And we think of ourselves as a center for learning and discussion and conversation about how the media can grow and be strengthened to be a voice for the people, to be platforms for engagement and democratic discussion and participation in the development of our country. And we are also an organization that is interested in public communication. So a significant part of our work at ACME is to participate in the education of citizens of all walks of life in how to use, consume media, and how to create media of their own, so that they too can be active participants in our discussion as a country. We have developed a set of guidelines to enable the media's coverage of this electoral process, to enable them to do this systematically, thoughtfully, and with a little more analytical, with a greater analytical lens. These guidelines were first developed several years ago, over 10 years ago. So they've just been revised and updated to deal with our times.
Opinion polls will start rolling out, projecting what is likely to happen, who is losing, who is winning, what are the issues that Ugandans are concerned about. But when it comes to projections, that's where the issue really is. So we suggest that media houses that must report, must cover opinion poll findings must, or rather should, include enough context. For example, what are the current numbers? What did the numbers look like before? What are the trends previously? When was the poll done? What was the sample size? The usual sort of stuff that we do for every opinion poll, but just taking that little extra care when it comes to elections. And we also suggest that no poll results shall be announced 8 hours to election day. Just to check whether we have this actually in the law. It might be there, but in a lot of jurisdictions, they prevent journalists from announcing who is winning and who is losing, especially in the presidential election, 48 hours to election day. So the coverage on polls stops 2 days too. We have the Vox Pops, where you send your journalists into the street to go, ask people what do they think about X, Y, Z. And we are saying that's not a scientific poll and should be treated as such and shouldn't be presented as though it were a scientific poll. Now, coverage of incumbent and government activities, and we're saying by virtue of the president being a president, but also being a candidate, by virtue of a ruling party being also a party that is contending in the election, that we should take care to cover them when they're doing political work as such, meaning that if they say things, they attack opponents have a right to respond. But if they're doing government work, you know, opening a new bridge, a new road, you know, handing out scholastic materials to, I don't know, X number of schools, that is done as government should be covered as such, and that is done as electioneering activity should be covered as such. And where the two are mixed, journalists ought to make a distinction.
On the media across the board, not just from the politicians, the candidates, but even the public, even from within the media house itself. There's demands from fellow editors, from reporters, and everything. I think one of the first things we should do is to appreciate feedback and understand where these people are coming from, because at the end of the day, we are giving information to people. We're sort of the voice of many people out there. So it's while it's difficult to be able to carry everyone's opinion, everyone's you know, maybe say campaign and what happened and everything, it is important to understand that we need to be as objective and as widespread as possible. So the first thing is to appreciate feedback from these people and sort of ask and say, okay, what did we miss? Do they have a point? Are we not covering exactly what they said? If it's a particular area, is it true that we are not maybe covering the opposition in this area? Is it true that we're not covering the government? I mean, the ruling, you know, party right now in this area. So the first thing I believe is for us, we need to be able to do, to take the feedback and analyze it, and actually analyze it and go back and say, okay, let's look at the last, you know, stories, the last number of stories we did, the last number of, you know, have we been able to be as fair as possible? So for me, first is to be able to take that feedback and just analyze it. And then the second is to be able to understand how to then work on that feedback. Because in my experience, it doesn't help to ignore that. You just sort of either place yourself in a corner, or you end up stamping that perspective of yourself if you're not doing something about the feedback, especially if you analyze, if you do a proper analysis and find that you might have fallen short. So the other thing to do is to be able to sort of look back, like Bernard was saying in the guidelines, to sort of be able to see how fair are we being, what kind of work are we doing, what kind of stories are we airing, are we putting out, and you know, in what lights are we doing them? Our stories skewed towards a certain narrative for a particular person or a particular party. Is that skewing? Is it maybe warranted? Is it because of what that person is doing? So the other thing is to sort of look back and sort of see, okay, how have we done, and now what should we be able to do going forward? But also to realize that we have to make like guidelines. I'm sure many media houses have guidelines. So to be able to sort of say, what do our guidelines say when it comes to this? Are we following our guidelines? You know, like for example, at Nation Media, we have editorial policy, but also election reporting policies, you know, that are very specific on how to cover. So we need to sort of see, are we following those? Because those already, you know, put out the rules of how we're supposed to do this reporting. So part would be to understand that we may not be able to cover everyone the way they would like, or even the way we would like, because of resources, because of space, because of time. And to sort of give ourselves a bit of that slack, but in doing that, to be able to understand that we must, as far as our electoral policies are, we must be able to do as much as possible to be fair to everyone who's not to everyone, but to the bigger chunk of people who are out there. So for me, taking on the feedback, analyzing what you've been doing, and then working on that analysis are some of the ways I think that we should be able to sort of reduce, can I say, on that negativity of the media. It doesn't matter the kind of media house you are. Sometimes I feel like the mainstream media feel the pressure more than the smaller media, but that should not be the case. It should be whatever media house you are, you should be able to take that feedback and analyze and then work on it.
Because the media is going to be so much used as the platform to campaign, the media has to toe a very delicate line between them being a business and them as sources of information. So we are going to see different media houses, especially broadcast media houses, including radios and television, come up with different packages that will perhaps be sold to the political players. And that means that they're going to price these packages, and the politicians will come to buy the spaces so that they can be able to reach out to the electorate. Now, what does that therefore mean? That means that politicians who have the money will be able to get the bigger space. And the media, as we all know, has been badly hit by the coronavirus pandemic. This basically means that they are going to take in all the monies, they're going to strategically position themselves to amass all the finances from the different political players. So that means that the media has got to be very, very careful in this election. They're going to toe a very difficult path of, we need the money, we've been badly hit by the coronavirus pandemic and the economics are not adding up. So if you have the money, we'll give you more spaces. This means that the democratic space to discuss the quality of the leaders that we're going to be choosing, or the leaders that we're going to be having in the House or in the different positions of leadership, is going to be pretty much determined by the amount of money that the politicians have. The first point for me to note is that the media needs to not to only be blinded by the monies that are going to be coming up, that is going to be coming from the different politicians. And so we have a responsibility to our audience, to Ugandans, to be fair and balanced, just like Carol said. But it's going to be a very difficult position for them to be fair and balanced. And so I think organizations like ACME need to call out the media, independent organizations that are looking at how the media is operating, need to actually have a sound they need to put their foot down to ensure that fairness and everyone is given an equal political platform, right? So for me, that is going to be very critical in this election. I also think that the media needs to interest themselves in investigative journalism. I think investigative journalism is going to play a critical role in this election. Let me broaden this conversation. I think because everyone is so much interested in the numbers and the reach, because they can no longer go out and hold huge rallies, they're going to go on Facebook, they're going to go on Twitter, they're going to be sending out messages. And this is what is going to play out, Rachel and the rest of our viewers and participants. We are going to see telecommunication companies sell your data, your telephone numbers to MPs who are actually going to be sending out their messages of please vote for me. So you're going to receive anonymous messages. Honorable Solomon Serwanja will ask you to vote. Now cast your ballot. They're going to send you WhatsApp messages in audio. The question is, who gave them your number? Who gave them that data? Are we going to see another Cambridge Analytica in this election? Are the people who are managing Facebook going to manipulate your data and sell it out to the different political players? So I think that the number of investigative issues that the media needs to focus on, besides going into who said what where, besides going into the different town halls where different politicians will be asked questions, I think what is critical in this investigation is the media needs to be grounded in digging deeper.
Close to 300,000 Ugandans are stuck across the globe in different countries after the country closed its only major airport because of the COVID-19 pandemic. The Ugandans have been asking for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to repatriate them. We look at how Ugandan journalism has covered this emerging story, this very big story, and we talk to journalists who have been at the forefront of that coverage. We also talk to some people who are stuck in the countries and how they feel about the Ugandan journalism coverage of that repatriation story.
Right. Trisha, briefly first tell us the circumstances under which you ended up in the US and how long you've been there.
I feel like I've been here for 1,000 years, but I had come initially to do my LLM at Georgetown. And so then I completed, and Uganda was under an indefinite lockdown, right? So I joined hundreds of other Ugandans who were somewhat stranded and just had no way of going home. So for me, for the past month or so, I have been pushing to get, the government to open, but there's Ugandans who have been requesting to come home since March 22nd. Yeah.
So how has it been watching the Ugandan media reporting this repatriation story? If anything, do you feel that the Ugandan media has paid you any attention during the period of your being in the US?
I definitely think some attention has been paid, but I don't think that we have still answered some of the questions that, really led to our being studied in the first place. When I think that to understand the media's response, you have to also critique the narrative that was created by the state, which is that Ugandans abroad were the biggest health threat, right? Because in this idea of we are fighting a war, the enemy essentially was anybody who would return into the country, including Ugandans, right? So in analyzing why the media was slow to respond or why they did not perhaps push as much as they should be to ask the government to let Ugandans come back home, we have to also critique really like the whole narrative around we're fighting a war and there's certain people who are considered enemies. And so those are not really our priority right now.
The narrative bit is really interesting because the media and narratives is one of the powerful things that the media picks up on. Do you think that the Ugandan media picked up on the narrative that you people were actually the health risk to the country without actually questioning this?
I think that they did not critique it as much as they should have. And we also have to understand that a lot of things have been happening in the country at the same time, right? And so when COVID happened, a lot of countries reacted to ensure lockdowns. And that was important, you understand? But there's Ugandans who are stranded, right? Not only Ugandans abroad, actually. There's a lot of Ugandans who these lockdown measures have adversely affected. And I think that in order to understand if Uganda has been effective, we need to look at the consequences of those lockdowns, right? And I think that specifically in media responding to Ugandans stranded abroad in the way they have, part of that has been sort of an acceptance that this is what needed to be done. And so this is justifiable. But I don't think it is, because a lot of countries have not reacted the way Uganda has reacted and have still managed, and in many cases, way better than Uganda has. And so for me, I think that there was a narrative that was pushed by the state that was not questioned and that was seemingly justifiable, that has left a lot of Ugandans stranded and ignored largely.
What do you think the media could have done better to break down this narrative so that in a way it offers even you people who are in the US stranded at this moment, what could the media have done to break that narrative and offer you a chance to be heard?
So right, at the core of it, this is a question of what Ugandan citizenship means, right? And the duties and responsibilities of the state to its citizens. That's at the core of it. So we have to look at this COVID response really in that continuum. And Ugandans abroad is just a small subset of what we need to be analyzing critically, right? So if a state responds by ignoring, even if it's just 2,400 allegedly, now, Ugandans abroad, then that's a failing, right? Because these are Ugandans who are taxpayers. These are Ugandans who are, they only have Uganda, you get it? Because foreign governments own nothing to us, right? So if the state can respond by saying these are not a priority and nobody questions that, then that's a problem. Because that then translates into how the state even responds to people at home. We've seen it with sort of the approach to giving out food, the consequences of the lockdowns on pregnant women and others. And so all those narratives that have been pushed that this is the only priority, fighting COVID, and everything else be damned, is something that we need to push back against.
I want now to talk very specifically about the repatriation and the conditions that the Minister of Health sort of communicated to the media and said, this is a list of conditions that people abroad must meet before they come back home.
Right.
Do you feel that those conditions were drawn up with the capable participation of people who had been abroad? And do you think that the media offered them a chance to be heard when those conditions were being met? But were they also fair to you?
things that some media people tried. But again, I think it has been really just individuals like yourself and Walter and other people who have said, well, this doesn't make sense to me, right? But I don't think that as like a whole, like the whole, like media has been like continually critiquing and looking at some of these policies and factoring in, that the humanness behind it. I mean, when you look at really the conditions that were set, we're talking about people who are telling you they have been stranded for 3+ months, right? Which means they have no money left, most of them. They have no health insurance in these countries. They are living on people's couches. And on top of everything, you're telling them that one, the state will not cater a single thing to their returning home, right? That on top of that, of having to pay for 14, and now I'm hearing 16 days of quarantine, that they must pay another 1,000 plus for their flights home, that they must get tested in countries where there's no mass testing happening, right? Where they have no health insurance, and really the state owes them absolutely nothing. I mean, all these preconditions are set to make it difficult for people to return, and that's not what Uganda should have been doing. Because ultimately, these are Ugandan citizens, and the state, like all other states have done, should have been, at least, you can subsidize the cost, because we understand it's expensive, but we're borrowing money, that we are going to pay back. So where is this money going if it's not actively helping people who need it the most, right? So I think that looking at just the SOPs that have come months after we have been making noise, when you look at just the indifference of the state, for me, it's a scary thing as a Ugandan, because, why should our lives be so disposable, the way that the state continuously makes it seem to be? And so I think for me, that's my biggest issue with SOPs. They're not based in any empathy. They don't seem to factor in all the difficult conditions that Ugandans are facing abroad and at home. You get it? Because these are people who still depend on people at home. People have not been working. So even if you had family that could previously have supported you, they simply just can't afford it now, right? So you have to be able to factor in all those conditions and say, okay, fine, we're going to subsidize the cost, because we understand that none of us could have prepared for this. And because we're borrowing money specifically to cater for Ugandans, this is one of the ways in which we're going to do that. But we've seen none of that.
The other thing that I wanted you to talk to us about is how the media has been able to reach you. You've been a source in many of the media stories. How have journalists reached you? What kind of hardships have you had communicating to journalists, or even having your story told on Ugandan media?
I think it's also a function of privilege, to be honest, and I acknowledge that, because a lot of the ways that I have been able to push these stories because of my personal connections, right? So I'm friends with Ray, and so I will ask him, and he will try. I am friends with Walter, so it's that, right? And that is why initially, when I thought, okay, the government is not moving, we need to get onto social media and push this hashtag Repatriate Ugandans, because I understood that people will only respond when they fully understand that it's not just Patricia who is suffering, right? There's millions of Ugandans who have been really, really stuck. And so in order to leverage my friendships and my connections with people in the media, we had to create some sort of actual Twitter storm, so that people could just not afford to ignore us anymore. And that's exactly what we did. And interestingly enough, in the next week or so, we have actually seen more action than we have seen in months, right?
Mm-hmm. And that's the other thing that you preempted. What has been the role of social media in amplifying your message, but also in you being able to speak to Ugandan health authorities directly without media interference?
Right. I mean, I think that what social media does is that it makes people more accessible, right? So I can tweet and say, listen, to the Honorable blah, this and this and this, why aren't you acting? And it becomes impossible to ignore when thousands of people are agreeing and asking the same question, right? And I think that's what happened with this time. Is for a long time, it was simply just a couple of people speaking. And then a week or so back, when Repatriate Ugandans began, it became impossible to ignore, because even Ugandans back home were asking for an explanation. Because what we did was just sort of laid bare all the claims that were being made. And we said, this doesn't make sense anymore, right? And then we saw media people as well, I think, begin to question and say, this doesn't make sense. And then we had people in other countries say, this doesn't make sense. Why is the Ugandan state ignoring these people? So I'm a big believer that social media can be used and has been used several times as a tool to effect change and to at least, at the very least, shame our governments, right? And I think that in this instance as well, it really did work.
Trisha, you now have a few days to return to Uganda, at least as far as we understand it. Yes, fingers crossed. Just tell us, are you going to be documenting your return to Uganda? And how would you like the Ugandan media to behave between now and when you return? And what kind of questions should they ask about your return?
So, I mean, I think that it's not really just my return, it's Ugandans' return in general, right? Because there's Ugandans who have already arrived. And we've been, listen, to be honest, I'm afraid because I don't know what's going to happen, right? Because you hear stories about people booking their own quarantine places and then getting to the airport and being forced to go to other places to pay more money than they have, right? You hear all these, you see these videos of these patients in hospitals that have no water, that are telling you there's no medical personnel who checks on them, right? All these SOPs saying they're going to confiscate our passports. I mean, it's the criminalization of Ugandans, really. And I think that the media needs to be focused on those questions. Are people, okay, if people have come home, what are the conditions in these quarantine centers? Is the Ministry of Health actually testing people? Why is the Ministry of Health now saying people are going to be in quarantine for 16 days and not 14 days? I mean, there are so many loopholes there that we need, and we really rely on the media at home to be able to push these questions, because without the media, just nothing gets done, nothing gets really told. So I'm hoping that within the next 3 weeks, as people return, all these questions can be asked and answered. So that hopefully by the time the last batch begins to trickle in, a lot of these things are more settled.
All right, thank you so much for speaking to us, Trisha.
Few moments in broadcasting history are as traumatic as a guest picking a mobile phone on air. And this week, an ABS TV presenter had to deal with one of the country's biggest media estates, Tamale Mirundi, picking a mobile phone on air. We leave you with that and thank you so much for joining us for the Fourth Estate. We continue to critique the media and how they cover the big stories. But from us to you, have yourselves a good week.